Hello and welcome to this new podcast on the COVID-19 and cardiovascular disease series. We've had a number of questions from you about the use of cardiovascular drugs in patients with COVID-19 or in the anticipation of perhaps getting infected with the virus. So I'm very pleased to say that tonight you will have your questions answered by a real expert in this area, and that is Professor Garret FitzGerald from the University of Pennsylvania, who is a clinical pharmacologist of international renown. So thank you very much, Garret, for joining us here at the EAC and for answering the questions from our community, patients. So first of all, let's start with the anti-inflammatory agents right down your street. And as you know, there has been a number of inconsistent questions and advices that have been issued about drugs. Are they beneficial or dangerous in patients with COVID-19? And recently, the FDA has issued a statement that, to me, is a little bit of a maybe, a little vague about maybe it might deny the utility of diagnostic science in detecting infections, which for COVID-19 doesn't look to me like is particularly relevant. So what is your take on that? Should people taking anti-inflammatory drugs continue to take them? Should we use them in these patients or not?
So Barbara, thank you. Very nice to be with you and to chat with your audience. For people who are taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, like ibuprofen, for example, or indeed acetaminophen, for a legitimate reason, like chronic pain with arthritis, there's absolutely no reason why they should not continue to take these drugs. That's really the bottom line. So there have been some anecdotal reports in both directions, actually, suggesting that prostaglandin suppression by non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs could be desirable or undesirable in the setting of COVID-19. These are really nothing more than anecdotes and don't amount to evidence, and certainly don't amount to evidence for people to stop taking these drugs. Is there any biological plausibility around these suggestions? Well, as is often the case, there is, but it's complicated. Prostaglandins can promote inflammation, they can restrain inflammation. And I could come up with reasonable suggestions as to why they might be good for you or bad for you, but really without evidence, we shouldn't act. So what we're doing at the moment is really trying to collect large amounts of data on people who are infected but without symptoms, so that we can track them and determine factors that may identify the patients who are likely to pursue a serious course. And then that would afford us the opportunity to test whether preventative measures could be helpful in those patients. But to come back to the original question, there's really no reason for somebody who is taking a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug for something like the pain of arthritis to stop taking their drugs. And what's a real reason to pay attention to that is that we have so few alternatives for pain relief in inflammation. And really it's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are opiates. And the last thing I'd want anybody to do is to switch to opiates for this reason.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, you said that this is complicated and prostaglandins are complicated. And I think the story around the ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blocker, is also extremely, with evidence showing that there might be a benefit, other evidence showing that having an upregulation of the ACE2 receptors for the virus to enter the cells might actually worsen the infection. So that is in the doubt, people say, oh, well, you should stop it, or in the doubt, people say perhaps you should continue. And, my feeling is there isn't enough evidence really to stop an agent such as an ACE inhibitor in a patients who need it for a cardiovascular disease on the basis of this mostly in vitro or in animal, experimental evidence. And the experimental evidence goes in both directions. So what is your take here? What would you do? I mean, would you stop ACE inhibitors, ARB, say, in patients a mild indication that there may be beneficial, such as mild hypertension, which is advocated in my university, for instance?
So again, there are some similarities between the two situations. The first similarity is that the recommendations to stop or to switch are really based on anecdotes, and the anecdotes go in both directions. And then if you move from the clinical anecdotes to the science, again, the science is potentially very interesting in that one can make a rationale as to why it might be desirable to stop an ACE inhibitor or to start an ACE inhibitor. There's a lot of interesting science to be done, but what we don't have is any rigorous evidence to provide a public health advisory for somebody who's controlled on an ACE inhibitor or an ARB to stop taking their medicine. And as we know, there can be serious consequences if they stop. But even to switch to another class of antihypertensive drug takes some time in many cases to readjust the dosing, to reestablish control. And if you're tolerating an ACE inhibitor well, if your blood pressure is well controlled, there is no scientific basis for you to stop doing that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we have here, we had before the statement that we issued at the Council of Hypertension of the European Society of Cardiology has issued exactly a statement along the line that you're describing, but then
yes.
There have been other.
Yeah, I think it's important for the public to understand that there's a slow process of the accumulation of consensus. And what we have on this particular issue now is a clear accumulation of consensus. So there have been 2 papers in the New England Journal just in the last days, one from Scott Solomon in the US, one from John McMurray in Scotland, both coming to the same conclusion, which is the one that I have just outlined. And in terms of nonsteroidals, there was a warning listed from the WHO, driven by some cavalier commentary from a French minister around NSAIDs, and that warning has been withdrawn, as has the warning by the EMA. So I think it's not just an individual offering an opinion here. The consensus has really formed around these 2 issues, that if you're taking an ACE inhibitor, you're tolerating it well, there's no reason for you to stop. And similarly, if you're taking a non-steroidal for chronic pain, there's no reason for you to stop.
Yeah, in France, I was told that people were actually stopping the aspirin in secondary prevention as well as a result of.
Yeah.
So that is even potentially.
No, there was great confusion created by the French Minister of Health, suggesting that people switch from ibuprofen to acetaminophen, which is sort of absurd in that acetaminophen is just a little lower down the dose response curve than ibuprofen, with exactly the same mechanism of action of prostaglandin suppression.
Yeah, that's good. So you have been a very critical, of the use of chloroquine. So, the president of the United States has said that chloroquine is potentially one of the biggest game changers in the history of medicine. And, there are trials of chloroquines. It is actually a standard therapeutic agent used in Italy in patients with COVID. And there is a trial, I think, also in physicians in terms of prevention of development of. So what is your take? What is the evidence that chloroquine is such a wonder drug for COVID-19, potentially? I mean, it would be nice if it was, but...
So chloroquine is a drug that's been with us for a long time. It's a derivative of quinine, which used to be known as Jesuit bark, because the Jesuits from South America took it to Europe as a cure for malaria. An interesting aside is Oliver Cromwell died of malaria and refused to be treated with Jesuit bark because of his anti-Catholic bias at the time. However, I digress. But that brings me to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump fastened on a non-randomized, very small study conducted by a French investigator that had several design flaws beyond not being randomized, that suggested that there was benefit to people from COVID with chloroquine. I think to any rational scientist, this study and the ones you referred to really raise a question. They certainly don't answer a question. And a bit like those clinical anecdotes I talked about earlier, it certainly is not the basis for a public health advisory. And Trump's irrational attribution of merit to this study and encouragement to people to start thinking about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as game changers drove people to hoard these drugs at the expense of people who actually need them. So chloroquine is quite effective in forms of lupus, and a shortage of chloroquine developed as people started to hoard these drugs. Now, it's one thing to hoard those drugs and keep them for when you get infected with COVID and get sick. It's another thing to encourage people to take them while they are asymptomatic in the hope they will never develop COVID, which is what people have started to do.
That's right.
And these drugs are not innocuous. In fact, it's an outrageous thing to encourage people to take these drugs as preventatives. Their common side effects are mostly gastrointestinal. We know that COVID itself can present with gastrointestinal problems. So it clouds the issue as far as that's concerned. But even more disturbingly, it can cause arrhythmic death, or arrhythmias at least, in rare patients as well. So I think this encouragement for people to get out ahead of the evidence has had a lot of adverse impact. Having said all that, the question has been raised, and the way to address the question is to do a randomized trial. And with the rapid acquisition of patients, unfortunately, it has become very easy for us to do randomized trials pretty quickly. And I know in our institution, randomized trials of hydroxychloroquine are going on, and I'm sure that is true in many other institutions as well. So we'll start having rigorous evidence shortly. And before that evidence is on the table saying we should take it, I strongly advise people against either hoarding it or taking it.
Yeah, no. Well, and apart from chloroquine, do you see, where would you put your money, essentially? There are many trials, and sometimes I wonder whether we will be learning how to do very rapid, very effective and streamlined adaptive trial during this period. But the hope that there will be something working, it's less clear to me. You know, maybe because I'm always thinking about mechanisms, and that something has to have some reason for, rather than say, well, we have this bunch of antivirals, let's randomize them. Do you see anything more than that? So
I think there are, first of all, I think there's lots of reason for hope. Mm-hmm. I think the first reason for hope is we know what flattens the curve. We have the evidence now. We have it from Wuhan versus the rest of China. We have it from other Asian countries. We now have it from Italy. We are beginning to have it in Spain. We have it by comparing Seattle to New York City. So introduction of isolating measures and adherence to them by the population works to flatten the curve. And that message has trickled through with variable efficacy to different places. But we know that, and that is a reason to hope. So that can stop our health services being overwhelmed. So I would say, from where I sit, the hierarchy of reasons to be hopeful are, first of all, there's a big effort to study the serology here. When people are infected, do they develop protective antibodies? For now, the actual scientific evidence that they do is limited. It's limited actually to studies in a couple of macaques that were infected, developed antibodies like we do, were challenged again and were protected. So there's a huge emphasis on developing serological assays, being able to determine whether the antibodies we develop are indeed protective. And if they are, that first of all will remobilize our infected members of the healthcare community to allow them to go back into the fray. And that will be a game changer. And it raises the possibility, as has been done with other viral disease, of potentially a therapeutic intervention with the plasma of people who have survived. So that's one reason to think positively. A second reason to think positively is for the last 4 months now, several groups around the world, including one here in Penn, have been working on the development of vaccines against COVID. And now we have many other groups across the world more recently who've got into this game. Just speaking very locally, the individual who developed effective vaccines against MERS and SARS-related coronaviruses, Dave Weiner, began his vaccine trial last week. And just as you say, I think we're not only going to see a remarkable acceleration of impact in terms of bringing novel therapeutics to assessment such as this, but also an acceleration in the regulatory consideration for approval once these interventions begin to develop safe and efficacious impact. So I'm optimistic that some of these diversified approaches to vaccine development are going to be effective. I think we've got some very imaginative approaches in terms of novel therapeutics directed against proteins expressed or that are necessary for the vaccine to mate with our cells, for some novel antivirals or that have been used against related viruses that we can assess very rapidly in these clinical trials, just as you say. So I think as war often accelerates technology development that becomes useful after the war is over, I think this particular war is already having a huge impact on our ability to develop therapeutics rapidly, to assess them rapidly, to make them widely available, and to regulate their safe dispersal. So I'm optimistic on all those fronts.
Yeah, may that last, may that be the inheritance of this, yes. That is so difficult otherwise. Yes. So you've been very clear on your take-home message, but let's go through it again, like the last message to our audience.
So I would say that if you're on NSAIDs, if you're on ACE inhibitors or A or Bs, keep taking them until rigorous evidence, not just anecdotes and opinions, emerges to the contrary. For now, there is no rigorous evidence for you to stop taking those drugs. Secondly, I'd say don't hoard, and especially don't take chloroquine as a preventative. Randomized trials are already underway to actually provide evidence as to whether it provides any safety or efficacy at all. Personally, I'm not holding my breath, but that's just my individual anecdotal bias. and the accelerated approval of COVID as an indication for chloroquine is just really a distraction. It's a political stunt, in my view, that has nothing in terms of reality as far as the FDA providing any stamp of approval of chloroquine compared to other opportunities. But there's lots of research going on. It's a rapidly moving field. The entire scientific community has really got mobilized at a global level to address this. And I'm optimistic that they will.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Garret. You've been very clear, very informative, and I think you put all the questions really to rest for the moment, as well as having the silver lining at the end. So thank you,
Barbara.
Much, Garret. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.